At the most recent NATO summit, world leaders, to include Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, were caught on camera making fun of Donald Trump behind his back. I want to show you that video, and then I want to show you Donald Trump's response. But then I want to talk a little bit about the details of his response, because I think that there's something important there that we can glean from that about NATO and maybe a little bit about the future of the alliance. So let's watch these clips. We'll laugh at it, and then we'll get a little bit more serious. So that's that clip. Now I'll just go right on ahead to Donald Trump's response.
Well, he's two-faced.
Do you think that Germany is too naive?
And honestly, with Trudeau, he's a nice guy. I find him to be a very nice guy. But, you know, the truth is that I called him out on the fact that he's not paying 2%. And I guess he's not very happy about it. I mean, you were there, a couple of you were there, and he's not paying 2%, and he should be paying 2%. It's Canada, they have money, and they should be paying 2%. So I called him out on that, and I'm sure he wasn't happy about it, but that's the way it is. Look, I'm representing the U.S., and he should be paying more than he's paying, and he understands that. So I can imagine he's not that happy, but that's the way it is.
So what Donald Trump is referring to, because he's 2%, 2%, 2%, and if you've been paying any bit of attention to when Donald Trump talks about NATO, he's always talking about this 2% figure. So this 2% figure refers to in NATO, it sort of stipulates that the goal for every country is that they pay 2% of their GDP towards defense, and that's considered to be essentially like their contribution to NATO. And so I want to talk a little bit about whether or not that's a good thing, right? So currently, I think only something like 7 countries are paying their 7% into NATO, and the rest are not. Donald Trump thinks this is a huge problem. It's free riders, free riders, free riders. But what's interesting is you'll remember on the campaign trail, Donald Trump actually criticized NATO. He said that NATO was essentially obsolete, to which, of course, Hillary Clinton, being the establishment person that she is, just responds saying, how basically praising NATO, how wonderful NATO is. And to be fair, there are people who genuinely do defend NATO. I'm not saying that like you have to be a hack in order to defend NATO. Although I'm going to suggest to you that defending NATO is a bit of an uphill battle. So the question that I want to ask is NATO obsolete? So NATO was essentially founded during the Cold War in order to prevent Soviet aggression or prevent the spread of communism. You know the story, right? But what's interesting is after the Cold War, now it's not entirely clear what NATO's purpose is, or if it has any kind of purpose at all. And I do think that that is a problem which NATO faces, because why should all these countries pay 2% of their GDP towards defense if it is the case that they don't really see they don't really see a reason to it? And what I want to suggest to you today is that, or I should say my theory, my suggestion is that actually this whole not paying 2% thing in some sense has become a bit of a feature of NATO, not a bug, right? Like it's often criticized as, look at all these free riders, but actually I would suggest that that's become a feature of NATO, and then the question of is whether or not that's good. So what do I mean? Well, let's look for instance at the invasion of Iraq. So George W. Bush wanted to have a large multinational kind of coalition or group going into Iraq to make it look like it wasn't just the United States going in. And so part of what that required is, he needed NATO, he needed a lot of countries in order to do that. And so what ended up happening was the 5th expansion of NATO was basically fast-tracked big time. And so we had a bunch of other countries entering NATO all of a sudden. So in the 5th expansion, I think it was like 2004, I think it was like 2004. So they had countries like, I think it was like Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Romania, and I think there was one more. But essentially what happened with that expansion in NATO is then all those countries then turned around and immediately basically invaded Iraq. And so and there's good reason to think this, because the only one of those countries which entered into NATO which did not invade Iraq was Slovenia. And the reason why is just because is essentially because of public backlash. And by the way, there was a lot of public backlash even in the UK. There were massive protests against invading Iraq. So they weren't able to do it in Slovenia. And so Slovenia said, well, look, we'll invade if we can get a UN resolution, which of course never happened. Never got UN resolution, just went in there, right? And so but then when you actually look at what happened to these countries' military expenditure, they actually do go down. So when the Republicans turn around and say, and it's not just Republicans to be fair, there are it's actually fairly, I don't know that this one breaks down in terms of left and right. It seems to break down in terms of establishment or anti-establishment, whether or not you're for or against NATO. In general, there are exceptions. But, a lot of the people who will criticize NATO, or at least criticize the actors in NATO, will say is, well, hey, look, these people aren't spending a lot of money on GDP. That's expending a lot of money toward their military expenditures relative to GDP. They're not meeting the requirements. And that's true. And it is also true that sometimes they go down in expenditures. And I would suggest to you that after the Cold War, part of what happened is joining NATO became basically a treat, because you could join NATO, have other countries basically finance your defense, and then you don't have to spend as much of your money on on defense. So you can, use that money in other areas. And that's almost become the feature of NATO, because then the United States can use NATO membership, use the privileges that come with NATO membership in order to get what they want in either the UN or in international treaties. So it's kind of a weird situation where, Donald Trump, in some sense, is right but wrong at the same time, right? Like he was right when he was, because when Donald Trump was criticizing NATO, in some sense, he was absolutely right. Like NATO is absolutely obsolete. But then when he turns around and says, well, it's obsolete, and so, actually you just need to pay 2%, like, United States shouldn't be financing. In some sense, it's like he's right, but he doesn't seem to really get the role of it. Now, of course, we can criticize that, right? Like the invasion of Iraq was a disaster. And by the way, if you want another example, you can look at Kosovo, where the UN turned around and said that the invasion was illegal but legitimate. Part of what happened there was there was, some kind of I don't want to say backroom, but kind of backroom a little bit. And the UN investigation into the bombings in Kosovo came back, and there actually was some kind of connections with some of the NATO members, and getting that finding to come out the way that they, to find the thing that they wanted to find in that investigation, essentially. And so, in a sense, you could argue, you could argue that NATO's purpose is actually being fulfilled. Its new purpose, which you can, it seems like it's not very good, right? Its new purpose is actually being fulfilled by these countries not actually paying 2%. Right, so there's a weird kind of situation going on with NATO right now. My opinion on NATO is, I agree that it's obsolete, but I don't think that means that we need to immediately get rid of it. My view of it would be we need to slowly kind of get rid of NATO, because I do think that there could be, just historically, there have been issues where if you quickly disband treaties similar to NATO. Of course, NATO is much larger than any other alliance in history, but in that respect. But there can be, it can sometimes trigger arms races if you get rid of it really quick. So my view would be, yes, it's obsolete, but we do have to be a little bit careful in terms of taking it apart. That would be my one caveat to it. I wouldn't want there to be, some kind of accidental arms race. And by the way, while we're on the topic, I'll just say part of it's not like NATO is just like benign, right? Because NATO does aggress. I mean, so you'll remember the Russian invasion of Crimea. Part of the reason why that happened just was because of the fact that it was looking like Ukraine was possibly going to join NATO. And Russia didn't like that idea, and they wanted to make sure that they had access to ports, especially in warm water ports, especially in Crimea. And so they annexed Crimea, which, by the way, they did get what they wanted, although it actually it kind of backfired on them a little bit, because prior to part of the reason why Ukraine wasn't in NATO yet was just because public support for NATO wasn't very high. It was under 30% prior to the invasion of Crimea. But now, if you look at public opinion polling in Ukraine, the actual public support for joining NATO is nearly 70%. Like, I mean, to be fair, like, I mean, you can kind of understand why. They're like, oh shoot, like part of our country just got invaded. Let's get into a really big military alliance. So I mean, you can kind of see why that, you know, might happen in Ukraine. So it's not like NATO is benign. NATO does seem to abuse itself and kind of, you know, promote aggression. And the other thing is the way that the military alliance is currently structured is structured in such a way to exclude Russia in a number of respects. And so it ends up kind of reinforcing the enemy ness of Russia in a sense. And so those are some reasons why I do think that NATO is a little bit obsolete. I do think that we should move towards ending it, and I don't think that Donald Trump quite understands the practical function of NATO when he talks about the 2%, 2%, 2%. He's right and he's wrong, and yet he's still kind of right but completely wrong. It's a weird situation.